Great. So welcome to this Blockchain Co-Investors webinar. Today, we're very, very excited. We think we have an exceptional speaker. We're going to do a fireside chat and answer your questions. It couldn't be at a better time. It's about 4 weeks before America decides who will lead it into the next 4 years. And of course, for those of us who are investors in the transformation that we speak a lot about here at Blockchain Co-Investors, built on top of blockchain technology, then this is an important moment, perhaps. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. Just to get started, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Matthew Lemerle. I am a managing partner here at Blockchain Co-Investors, based in San Francisco and London. I'm then going to ask Mitch if you would introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. So Mitch Michigan here. I'm a partner at Blockchain Co-Investors. As you all know, Blockchain Co-Investors is a multi-strategy asset manager focused on blockchain. We're really excited about the sector, and the conversation today, has a lot of importance to what we do. So obviously we invest in, venture capital funds at the early stage. Our first fund of fund is likely the best performing in the world in its category. And then we also do direct investments, both into tokens and, mid-stage deals. And all of what we do, obviously we're always getting asked by both companies and by LPs about the impact regulation and government policy can have. And so today's conversation is super important, not only for us in evaluating our fund managers and our companies, but also for our LPs and helping them determine decisions to make in their investment horizon. So again, I'm based full-time in London, often in the US. So if you're ever in London, Zurich, New York, please do reach out to me, and we're always happy to take a meeting.
Thanks again. And we're very fortunate today that we have a guest joining us. We know that there are very important conversations occurring in Washington, D.C. And so we thought it would make sense for our audience and for everyone who's going to be listening to this webinar later to hear direct from the center of US government. And so we invited Kristen Smith. And Kristen, who is a good friend of ours, has been working very diligently to build a very important organization. And I'm going to ask her to just open up by telling us briefly, what is the association that Kristen has built and that she leads, and who is she and what's her background? So Kristen, if you could just introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Mitch, for allowing me to join you today. I absolutely love to talk about what's going on in Washington right now because after many years of work, I think that we are starting to turn a corner, and that as we get into next year, we have a very promising pathway to getting some stability on the policy front. But I'll do a quick intro of myself. My name is Kristen Smith. I'm the CEO of the Blockchain Association, and we are a trade association based in Washington, D.C. for companies in the crypto industry. So we have about 100 organizations with the big names like Coinbase and Kraken and Anchorage, and also a lot of funds and projects that are part of the association as well. So everyone who is a member wants to see better policy outcomes in Washington. And so we work with the various branches of the federal government. We do a lot of work on Capitol Hill, doing education and lobbying on legislative issues. If there's opportunities to engage on the regulatory front, we do that as well through comment letters and educational activities. And then importantly, we follow very closely all of the activity that's going on in the courts. And so we often will weigh in and educate a judge with an amicus brief. But we also are actually suing the SEC ourselves. We sued them over their dealer rule that was enacted earlier this year. So we work with the three branches of government to try to get better public policy outcomes, and we've been around for about 6 years. It's been really, and we can go more into detail about this, but really amazing to see the industry become so sophisticated so quickly in Washington, and it's really just night and day to where it was even 18 months ago.
Great, Kristen. So for the audience's benefit, what we're going to do here is Mitch and I are going to essentially do an armchair chat with Kristen. We have a few questions we'll ask. We'll give her the opportunity to talk a little bit about this election, the issues, why this is an important time, and what are some of the outcomes that may occur. And then we will hold some time for questions, but only at the very end. And if any of you do have a question, you're free to put it into the chat. But I want to say right up front, we do not promise we'll get to every question. The first question I have, I want to give a little bit of context to this. Over the last 30 or 40 years, we've seen governments and cities and regions around this world spend probably trillions of dollars on trying to stimulate innovation. They all want to be leaders in innovation-based industries. They all want to be leaders in enterprise technology, in life sciences, in digital assets, and sustainable energy. And the fact of the matter is, most of what governments do is a complete waste of time. They accomplish nothing. And the truth is, the world's global innovation centers are the same today as they were 20, 30 years ago. And most of the other wannabes have got nowhere. So despite the fact that we all know that Al Gore invented the internet, is it true that politicians are helpful at driving innovation? What's your view after 4 years of the Biden-Harris administration? What have they taught you about their ability to influence an industry such as ours?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I am a big believer in free markets, and I think that when it comes to government and innovation, I do think government has a role to play in that. First, it should do no harm, right? And we should make sure that governments are not standing in the way of innovation. I think in the case of blockchain and crypto, this is a really unique technology that has an associated asset class with it. And it is very different than what we see in the securities world or even the traditional commodities world today. And so I do think we actually need the Congress to step in and put a regulatory framework in place. Like, I don't think this is a situation where no regulation is the best option. I think actually having some regulation would be very good for the industry. I think what we've seen today is, as I kind of think across the past 3.5, 4 years with the Biden administration, is we've had an incredibly difficult time with one agency at most, but actually several agencies, and that's the SEC. The SEC has been so difficult to work with. I mean, I don't know if people saw the news yesterday, but a firm out of Chicago, a market maker, Cumberland, was charged by the SEC for violating securities laws. And this is a firm that had been in constant contact with the SEC over the past 6 years. They actually went out and acquired a broker-dealer in the event that one of the assets they were trading happened to be a security. They were doing everything they could to try to comply, to try to register, and the SEC still came out and sued them. I mean, it's absolutely incredibly bad for innovation when you have just this sort of constant fear of enforcement without being able to have any sophisticated dialogue. And so it hasn't just been the SEC. I think the banking regulators have also been very bad in that there's an environment in the banking world that banking crypto companies is not good. So it's been very frustrating. Now, there's a reason, some of this is happening, right? I mean, we had to deal with FTX and the fallout there, and Three Arrows Capital and Terra Luna. So we did have some very bad events a couple years ago that spurred this. I think if those had not happened, we would be in a different place with this administration. But I think it shows, I think the fact that the industry has been able to sort of survive FTX and move forward, puts the industry in a good spot with Congress. I think Congress is very open-minded right now. I think the presidential candidates, even Harris, is starting to say positive things, even though she's kind of been part of the Biden administration. So I think we have a very bright future on that front, but we still have this, sort of Gary Gensler who's looking in the past, but he's becoming increasingly isolated. And I think that, going forward, we've got a lot of opportunity to kind of stop what he's doing and put an alternative framework in place.
Great, thanks, Kristen. I'm going to ask Mitch to dive in and ask the next question.
I was just going to comment. I think for those of us in the industry, we agree with what you're saying, and it's quite frustrating to see the SEC not go after maybe some of the worst actors and go after the people who are trying to comply and doing everything they can the right way and being, very institutional and very high quality. So we completely agree with that sentiment. And I think I'm just going to dive right into the question that maybe, is at the top of everybody's mind in this sector. But, given all of that, given the last 4 years, how important is the November US election? Like, is everything to the sector? Is it not that much? Should we think about it in terms of, short term, it could have a big impact, long term, it doesn't matter. How do you look at the November election, as either a major or minor driver in terms of overall blockchain adoption long term?
Yeah, I think I think it's going to be a pretty big driver. I think you've got the presidential election and you've got the congressional election, and I actually think the congressional election is the most important. And interestingly, the results don't matter so much. It's just going to be the fact that we're going to have so many new people enter Congress that are familiar with crypto before they got there than needing to go in after they get there and educate them on it. And it's been really interesting. There's a tremendous amount of political activity going on in the crypto space right now. There is, and this is unaffiliated with Blockchain Association, but there's something called the Fair Shake PAC, which is a super PAC. It's raised $170 million this cycle, making it the largest of any industry PAC out there. And they have been very engaged in a lot of primary races, congressional races, and some Senate races. And so, I can say, not so much right now because we're getting very close to the election, but over the past 6 months, multiple times a week, we've had candidates visiting Washington that wanted to come in and meet us and learn about blockchain and crypto. And so we have met so many people before they've even gotten to Congress that, I think that on both sides of the aisle, we're going to have a much more open-minded set of policymakers next year. And so I'm very excited about that. I do think with the Senate, I think looks like that's going to go Republican, which would be very helpful because our biggest problem in the Senate is Elizabeth Warren. We also have very good Democratic champions in the Senate, like Kirsten Gillibrand, but Warren has been so problematic that having anything that mitigates her control is important. But I do think on the presidential side, having, it's going to be a change either way, right? Like the Biden administration is going, the Harris administration or the Trump administration is coming in. I think Trump has totally been orange pilled and he's all in on crypto. His speech in Nashville this year, it's, if you haven't listened to it, it's a very long speech. But he got very precise in some of his policy recommendations, like down to preserving self-custody, not having a CBDC. The big applause line was when he called for firing Gary Gensler on day one, which he then repeated because he was so surprised by the response he got there. So I think that, there's no question Trump is going to be very open-minded to crypto. Harris is not as far as Trump, by no means, but she's in a couple of speeches now has talked about the importance of blockchain innovation and digital assets innovation, which is, a first step. We clearly, as an industry, need more specifics in that. But given that she entered the race at such a late stage, she hasn't gotten particularly specific on anything. And we've had a lot of conversations with folks on her campaign, and they're listening, they're, expressing that they're different. And so, I think there's an opportunity there. I think what
maybe
is
just
really
to double click on that, because I'm really curious about that, because obviously you're an insider, and for a lot of us, we're kind of on the outside looking in. Are the people around her, are they different than kind of the people around Biden? It's a kind of a specific question, but reading the tea leaves, being a Washington insider who lives there, what's kind of the sentiment of it, even if she doesn't want to be as
it's so the short answer is it's a mix. It's a lot of the Biden people. But there are some fresh faces as well. And I think that what we're hearing out of the Biden people is even a distancing from Biden himself, right? And so they're really trying to kind of, I guess, rebrand themselves as Harris people. And so they're very clear that this is different. They don't get into specifics, which is a little bit disconcerting, but again, also understandable. You have to understand with Trump, this was years, if not the last, kind of 9 months in the making of just a lot of meetings over and over and over with executives, really getting to understand this space and the importance of it. Like, it does not happen overnight. And so with Harris, the same thing is happening. The CEOs of the big companies are meeting with her team. We're meeting with her team. There's a lot of people that are trying to do the education and get her there. And so I think there's hope. I think the real, like, sort of test is going to be, if she does win, does she prioritize replacing the head of the SEC, and how quickly can she do that? Because she can, say all the things she wants at the end of the day. If we still have Gensler as head of the SEC, we're going to continue to have problems. Now, the good news is Gensler eventually is going to have to leave, right? He's going to term out in a couple of years. I mean, we don't want to have to wait that long. And so, he's not permanently in that job forever, but I think getting him out sooner rather than later is one of the single best things that could happen for the industry, and getting somebody.
Is there any way that they move him to the Treasury, which is sort of a rumor, right?
Yeah, I don't think so. We've run that down. That was a, I think Gensler Treasury is like the only way it could get worse in Washington. I don't think that's going to happen for a couple of reasons. Well, one, we don't think there's truth to that rumor, just because, like, there isn't, like, a reliable source for it. But two, as I said before, it is highly likely that the Senate will be under Republican control. And I think even if the Senate were under Democratic control, you have to remember the Senate plays a very important role in nominations, right? So that the president makes nominations to both the executive branch and independent agencies, but the Senate has to confirm those nominations. And Gensler is very unpopular with Republicans, and is also pretty unpopular with a lot of Democrats. And so I just don't think there's a world where he would get the votes to be confirmed as Treasury Secretary, given his track record that he's had at the SEC. I think that wouldn't just be like a fight crypto would take on. I mean, there are a lot of industries in Washington, and a lot of political advocates that would be pushing back against that. So I don't think he's confirmable, even if, for some reason he is on her short list.
Okay, so Kristen, what I've heard so far is that government isn't the biggest driver globally of innovation and creativity, not in America, not anywhere else, but it can be very destructive. It can be very difficult to work with, and it has been for the last 4 years. And you've obviously been meeting all of these people, the Bidens, the Harrises, the Genslers, the Warrens, over the last 3 and 4 years, and you're hopeful that if the Harris ticket wins, that things will change. At the presidential level, you've obviously given us a little bit of perspective on what the other side has been saying, the Trump-Vance ticket. Let's just double click on the Senate. So you've said, there seems to be a high probability that the Senate might go Republican, but can we get granular? We have, just to let you know, we have about 450 LPs in our funds around the world. It turns out that, yes, about 60 or 70% of them are in the US, and they probably have a pretty good grasp of how American politics works. But a lot of the people listening right now, I'm looking, we've got people in Europe, we'll have people in Asia. They don't necessarily understand how it works. So can you just double click on the Senate?
Yeah.
Which races are most critical, and where does blockchain fit into the potential candidates in those races? Could you? And also, does the crypto vote make a difference in terms of the Senate races that are about to be decided?
Yeah, so the Senate is very interesting because, right now, we know West Virginia is going to flip, right? That's where Joe Manchin, who has been a very kind of conservative-leaning Democrat, is leaving, and he's going to be replaced as a Republican. So if there are no other changes in control, just having that one kind of guaranteed change puts the Senate at 50-50. So Republicans would have to gain at least one more seat to have a majority. And a couple things that are important to note. One, only about a third of the Senate is up every 2 years because they have 6-year terms. So we're only dealing with, I think, 33 races this time. What's interesting about this year is if you look back 6 years ago was the midterm election after Trump was elected. And so there were a lot of Democratic victories 6 years ago in states that were very close. And so fast forward 6 years, that class is up again. And now there's a huge opportunity for Republicans to pick up seats. There are a couple of kind of key states that matter for crypto. So one of the most competitive races is Ohio. In Ohio, we have Senator Sherrod Brown, who is up for re-election. He is currently the chair of the Senate Banking Committee, who over the past several years has not done anything to advance positive crypto policy, and has said some negative things, and has also really empowered Gary Gensler to do what he has done at the agencies. And so the Fair Shake Super PAC that I mentioned earlier has announced that they're spending $40 million in favor of his opponent, Bernie Moreno, which is a very large sum of money to try to get Sherrod Brown out and to get Bernie Moreno, who actually was a blockchain innovator earlier in his career, into the Senate. And so that Ohio race is key in that the control of the Senate is kind of hinging on that race, but also the fact that the crypto industry has put a tremendous amount of investment. Another race that we're watching closely is Montana. Senator John Tester is up there running against Sheehy, who is the Republican challenger. That's another potential seat for the Republicans to pick up. There are other states like Nevada, Pennsylvania, Michigan, where there's opportunities for Republicans to pick up seats. Opportunities for Democrats, there's some speculation that maybe Texas or Florida could be pickups for Democrats, but recent polls indicate that that's unlikely. The one sort of unusually kind of surprise race is that in Nebraska, Deb Fischer, who is a Republican incumbent, actually has a pretty strong challenger from an independent who would then get to choose to maybe caucus with the Democrats. And so, that's a race that could potentially be an opportunity for Democrats. But, I think a lot of this, the down ballot races often hinge on like what's happening at the presidential level. Things could go different ways, but I think Ohio and Montana are looking like Republican pickups, which would mean that Republicans would control the Senate.
Thanks. So let me ask the question in a different way for the House of Representatives. We are blockchain co-investors. We are one of the top 10 backers of Stand With Crypto, which is bipartisan, and it seeks to put a spotlight on the realities of where your representatives sit on these issues. And in fact, anyone who's listening to this can go to Stand With Crypto. You can put in your own zip code and you'll find out exactly how your senators, your Congress people, and also your governor votes on these matters. And it's very interesting. But one of the things I'm finding interesting, Kristen, at the level of the House, is that when you actually start digging around, what you see is that there are some patterns. And one of the patterns is a generational pattern that younger elected representatives seem very pro our industries and more broadly, the innovation and digitalization agenda. And yet at the same time, it's not black and white, but the 60 years and up representatives seem to have more challenges understanding why this all is good for the end consumers and good for the American citizen. So just talk a little bit about the House. What does that look like from your vantage point, and what sort of trends are you seeing?
Yeah, the House is, sort of the conventional thinking is the House is also likely to flip and go from being Republican controlled to democratically controlled in the House. I think that the House, Elizabeth Warren has kind of been our big enemy in the Senate. In the House, we actually have a lot of champions on both sides of the aisle. And when there was a vote on crypto legislation earlier this year, and there were 71 Democrats that joined a majority of Republicans to support that bill. So I think that regardless of who controls the House, there's going to be a really good outlook for legislation next year. I actually think, interestingly, the Senate will probably go first on legislation next year. There seems to be a lot of interest in Republicans in the Senate really want to push forward a bill. But I think in the House, regardless of who controls it, I think we're feeling pretty optimistic that something can get done. I think that the Patrick McHenry, who's currently chair of the House Financial Services, is leaving, and he will be very much missed because he was the big driver of legislation this year. But I think on the Republican side, there are a lot of folks that want to pick up where he left off. And increasingly, as I mentioned, on the Democratic side, we have champions there. The only thing that's maybe notable in the difference of a Republican-led House versus a Democratic-led House is that Republicans have term limits. Like they can only serve as the head of a committee for 6 years. And so there's often more incentive for Republicans to try to get things done quickly. Whereas, the Democrats, once they get into these positions, they tend to hang on to them for a long time. So sometimes there's a different sort of sense of urgency. But I really do think, regardless of who's in control, that these are, it's nonpartisan tech, therefore the policy should be bipartisan, and we've seen strong bipartisan interest, particularly in the House. So yeah, I think the control doesn't matter so much on those races.
So maybe double clicking there, and you kind of alluded to it. What actual laws? You said a few bills might come up, and we're hopeful. So maybe just getting a bit specific. Where are we in the stages of lawmaking now? How might the November election flip that or change that or accelerate that? And then kind of what do we expect depending on that outcome next year? And again, maybe does it break down to we'll just get stablecoin if the Democrats win, or it's going to be market structure?
Yeah. I mean, I think those are the two issues you just mentioned, stablecoin and market structure. Excuse me. Those are the
maybe
big...
just very briefly, why don't you define those two again?
Yeah.
What exactly are a stablecoin bill and market structure? What might that entail?
No, so I would actually say broadly, there are three policy areas that are most interesting for Congress. The first is stablecoin legislation, and this goes back to 2019 when Facebook announced the Libra project. There's been a lot of interest in stablecoin, and the problem is there's not any regulatory framework in place for how to deal with stablecoins. They're so different than what we see in the traditional banking world today that those rules don't really apply. And this was a conclusion that not the industry came up with, but the President's Working Group, which is a working group of senior financial regulators, both in the Trump administration and again in the Biden administration, said, hey, we need to have some way to regulate so that when you have these centralized issuers of stablecoins, we know that those reserves are put in appropriate asset classes and that they're there, right? That there's audits and there's some standards around this. Like this just doesn't exist in federal law today. So putting that framework in place is something that should be relatively easy to do. It could actually happen in the lame duck, depending on how productive of a legislative session the lame duck being the period of time between the election and when the new Congress takes place. So basically the month of December. That is something that could be done in the lame duck, or I think it's something that could move fairly quickly, like Q1, Q2 next year.
And why is that? Why would it move quicker than other things?
Because it's sort of an isolated issue that has been very well vetted. I would say, in general, the legislative process is not something that happens in a couple weeks or a couple months. It takes, for something comprehensive, it can take up to 7-10 years to get a bill done, right? So if you look back to 2019, we're heading into 2025. Like this is something where there have been a dozen plus congressional hearings on stablecoin legislation. There have been drafts in both the House and the Senate. There have been a lot of ideas that have been publicly vetted and refined, and it's just kind of ready to go. It's not something that somebody just introduced yesterday. This is an issue that's been debated longer than any other issue. So we could see some movement on that. The second issue set is kind of what has come to be known as market structure legislation, and there's a couple of elements to this, right? I mean, I think that those of us in the industry think that most of these digital assets are commodities, not securities. Gary Gensler obviously disagrees. He thinks everything's a security. We think they're commodities. Typically, federal regulators do not regulate commodity spot markets. Like if you go buy wheat, there's no federal regulator for that, right? If you buy wheat futures, there are, but not like wheat, the commodity. So if you go and buy Bitcoin, there's no federal regulator for that, for those marketplaces. But these do like look and feel a lot more like financial assets.
The background there is that the SEC has, more or less determined Bitcoin is a commodity, correct?
Yes. Yeah. Everybody agrees Bitcoin and now sort of reluctantly Ethereum are.
And everything else is sort of in a gray area / Gary Gensler says is a security, but
yes.
There's no real, way to determine that that's been legislated.
Yes. But, we think that, for these centralized exchanges that are trading, creating cash markets for these crypto commodities, which again, we think is more than Bitcoin and ETH, but, we want to know that there's safe custody of those customer assets. We want to know that the institutional traders have appropriate oversight. We want to know that there are sufficient disclosures for investors and users on what those assets are. We want to make sure that there's bankruptcy protections for customers when they're using these service providers. So there's these types of both kind of oversight of the market, but also, a disclosure element to it that doesn't exist in law today, right? The SEC disclosures are about the health of the company, not necessarily like what's going on with the network, which is what drives a lot of the value in the crypto world. And so we really do need something new and tailored if we want to provide these sort of just like basic level of consumer protections. And so there was a lot of progress on it this past year. We had the FIT 21 bill, which again had a bipartisan vote in the House this past spring. That was, I think, surprised everyone with how much Democratic support it had. And then over the summer and into the fall, the Senate has been working on their version of market structure called the Digital Commodities Act. This bill hasn't been publicly circulated yet, but it takes, I think the latest drafts I've seen actually address a lot of the challenges that we thought the FIT bill had, and really, I think, has advanced the knowledge level and conversation at the committee level. So I think we have a pretty good base to start from next Congress, and I think next Congress could be the year that we see all of these pieces come together. The third legislative issue, which quite frankly, from an industry perspective, we don't think a whole lot needs to be done, but from a congressional perspective, there's often a lot of confusion, is illicit finance. There are a lot of bills, including ones by Senator Elizabeth Warren, that attempt to take things like the Bank Secrecy Act or IEPA, which does sanctions, and apply those to different parts of the crypto ecosystem that don't have the ability to comply. Like they want to apply custodial regulation to non-custodial entities, and it just doesn't work. And so, a lot of those conversations that we have is people don't realize that the Bank Secrecy Act, Coinbase already complies with that, right? Like all the centralized intermediaries are already doing this. There's a tremendous amount of information. And on top of that, you actually have these public transparent blockchains that empower law enforcement. And so you combine these like KYC on-ramps and off-ramps with the ability to track and trace a blockchain, and law enforcement actually loves it when criminals use Bitcoin because they can track it down and in many cases get it back. So a lot of that is kind of an education issue. There might be some additional authorities that we can come up with that would be helpful to law enforcement, but a lot. I don't think there's anything that we actually need to promote innovation there. I think it's just making sure nothing bad happens on those fronts. So yeah, long answer, but those are kind of the various things that the Congress has got to do. And I think that, next Congress, we're going to have these, this set of educated lawmakers. There's a lot of interest in getting something done. There's been a lot of groundwork laid. As I said, these things don't happen overnight. So I think, next year should finally be the time that we get these bills across the finish line.
Thanks a lot, Kristen. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask the next question straight away. We're very transparent here at Blockchain Co-Investors. We publish our investment thesis, which is all the world's money's commodities and assets will be digitalized, and all the world's financial infrastructure will be upgraded to enable that, and it will happen. It's inevitable. It's just a question of how long it's going to take for the world to move to a true digital economy. We publish our strategies, our investment strategies, and we're pretty transparent about how we go about investing. And in fact, right now, we are scrambling to launch our new fund. And there's a very specific reason why we're doing that. When we sat back and we looked at this environment, it feels to us that any outcome of November is going to greatly accelerate blockchain innovation in the US. And I want to explain why we're thinking that, and maybe we're wrong. But just to give you, to take the two extremes, if we had a Republican clean sweep, President, Senate, and the House, of course, it would be a perfect storm for the industry. And we already know that because we've already seen the policies, as you said already, and there's been a lot of detail penciled out for what that one would look like. But if we take the other extreme, which is a Democrat clean sweep, presidential, Senate, and Republican, it still feels like we've made enormous progress. And notwithstanding the names you've thrown out a couple of times who have been trying to block and slow down innovation, the reality is, given in contrast to where we were 2 years ago, it seems that most of the Democrat elected representatives and officials understand at least something about our industry. They're beginning to engage with it. Their local citizenry are emailing them and writing to them and telling them this matters. They're certainly seeing money flow in the process of this election. And we think that when they actually sit down and analyze who voted for whom and so on, they're going to realize that in the 2026 election, this space matters. And of course, in 2025, as you already pointed out, a good number of these elected officials will start campaigning for their next election in 2026. And we don't think that they will be able to be hostile to our industry. So putting all of that together, our current hypothesis is whatever happens in November, America is going to be much more positive towards blockchain and digital monies and assets. And therefore, we need to open our new fund right now, get the capital in position, and be ready to catch that wave. Are we just drinking too much Kool-Aid, Kristen?
No, Matthew, I do not think you're drinking too much Kool-Aid. And I actually 100% agree with everything you've said. As I said at the beginning, I really think we've turned a corner. It might not feel like it this week because we keep seeing, people suing the SEC or the SEC suing companies or back and forth. But the problems are really isolated to two places, Gary Gensler and Elizabeth Warren. The rest of Congress is very open-minded and only going to get more open-minded to this as we head into next year. We have folks like Chuck Schumer voting for pro-crypto legislation, Nancy Pelosi, Catherine Clark, who's the whip in the House. Those are all strong Democratic leaders. We have Adam Schiff, who's heading over to the Senate, who used to chair the House Intel Committee as a Democrat. These are folks that are sort of leaders within their party and are beginning to understand how important this industry is. So there's no political upside to being anti-crypto right now. And I mean, we're even hearing, secondhand that Elizabeth Warren is admitting in private conversations that she miscalculated this issue. And so I think we're just starting to turn the ship. And the way everything's in place, it just needs to kind of keep churning. And I think it's really just going to be an issue of how fast does Gary Gensler get out, and if it's sort of a Kamala versus Trump thing. I mean, I think Trump being there it'll be kind of running out of the gate. I think Kamala or Harris, I should say, can get there. It's going to take, some more work and getting some more specifics out of her, but it's definitely within the realm of possibility because she's not going to want to go against all of the Republicans, all of her Democrats in the House and Senate who, see this as a political opportunity for themselves. And so yeah, I think it's not a question of if we've turned the corner. It's just, how fast we're going to be able to run once we get around the corner. But I think, there's a huge bipartisan consensus that legislation needs to get done. I think we've made a lot of progress narrowing the issues of the legislation and kind of doing education around what's needed, what's not needed, and that, if we get that in place, that should ease up, the litigation. I think, even looking at the courts, it's interesting because, as things tend to move up, the outcomes get better and better. And, I know there are some comments about the Ripple case. I mean, Ripple has done a fantastic job, making it clear that the token is not part of the investment contract, right? Like it's not, that's part of the investment contract, is not a security. And so, I think if that makes it all the way to the Supreme Court, like, the odds are going to be looking like pretty good for crypto. We're also seeing a tremendous amount of kind of offensive litigation where if a company gets a Wells notice, they'll come out and sue in advance of the SEC suing. So they get kind of an edge there. We're also seeing a lot of cases out of Texas. There's on different issues of these kind of pre-enforcement challenges where companies are saying, hey, I want to go into this. This is my interpretation of the law, but I need you to weigh in if it's correct. These are all things that could help in case there's a split circuit decision to bump something up to a Supreme Court. So I think the litigation strategy and the what's happening in the courts is very positive. I think what's happening in Congress is very positive. And I think if we get a new administration in with some fresh leaders, we could actually open up the regulatory channel, because there's a lot that the SEC could do without Congress to sort of clarify what can and can't be done. And so we haven't really had that yet. We've had a little bit of that at the IRS with rulemakings that they've done, but that's kind of the other way to make policy. And so if we could open up that channel as well, I think under the right leadership, it could be incredibly productive. And just to answer the questions in the chat, since I mentioned Ripple, Ripple is a member of Blockchain Association, and we've supported them with amicus briefs along the way, and I'm sure we'll do the same now that the SEC has filed an appeal.
So this conversation has been very US centric, which is obviously because it's an incredibly important part of what we do and what you do. But, blockchain is a global industry. We're a global team and we invest globally. We have team members in the UK and Europe and Asia. And I guess maybe just before, going on in a different direction, how should our Asian and European LPs and investors be thinking about potential US regulation and sort of the impact it might have on their markets? I know obviously Europe has passed MiCA, sort of stablecoin and market structure in a way. The UK obviously has some elements in its FSM, and now we're seeing sort of reopening in the Asian market in a lot of Asian economies. Yeah, just maybe just briefly comment on what we might like those LPs in those jurisdictions to know.
Yeah, no, well, and I'm certainly not an expert on the specifics of what's going on internationally, but I do think getting a U.S. framework in place would provide certainty for the U.S. market, and I think it's a big market. It still is. I think that if we do it right, I like to think that the U.S. regulation can be better than MiCA. I know MiCA has some shortcomings. I mean, at least it's something to go off of. But I think if the U.S. makes it attractive enough, we can get a lot of the startups here and a lot of the tokens issued here, as opposed to over there, which I guess if you're sitting over there, maybe you don't want that, but from the US perspective, that's what we're hoping for. But I also think if the US gets it right, it can serve as a model for other jurisdictions around the globe. But it's actually interesting. It's one of the motivators that gets Congress wanting to do this, is not wanting to lose the innovation overseas, which I think we already have lost a lot of that, right? Like there's not a lot of new things. There's a lot of things that are starting overseas first, and then maybe we'll come back to the US at some point. So
that's great, Kristen. Thank you. I'm sort of sitting here thinking about this, and it's been a very difficult 4 years. I think for the industry, for many of the companies and the entrepreneurs, particularly in the US. But it's really exciting, I think, to hear that you've got this groundswell of support in Washington. Obviously, you're very organized now. And when I say you, I don't just mean the Blockchain Association, I mean the entire industry. And we have a lot of people working very, very diligently to make sure people really understand what this is all about. And I think 4 years ago, even Larry Fink didn't understand what this was about. Today, the leadership of the financial industry understands, and I think the leadership of our country is beginning to understand too. And when we go out and we meet politicians in other places like London and Zurich and Tokyo, they and Hong Kong, they definitely understand this space. So it's been very informative. I'm going to ask you to give us some closing thoughts, but before I do that, I'm going to do the solicitation on your behalf so that you don't have to do that. The Blockchain Association obviously needs all of our support. You've met Kristen in person. I know that she will answer your questions if you join. She's very transparent and reachable. So that's blockchainassociation.org. And I am going to pitch for Stand With Crypto. That's also bipartisan. 2 million people or thereabouts have signed up for standwithcrypto.org. And they have a lot of tools. Coinbase is building a lot of software behind the scenes. And it's really great to just be able to put in your zip code and figure out who's representing you. And you can just press a button, send an email or a text message to your representatives through that platform. So those are two ways of getting involved. But Kristen, I think we've answered all the questions, and given the time, we're going to close this webinar down with your thoughts. What are your closing comments? What would you like all the investors of the world to know at this moment?
Yeah, no, I think to kind of sum up, it's been a bad couple of years, but we really have turned a corner, and there are three big reasons for that. And they all kind of relate to the politics and influence of the technology and the community and the industry. I think the first is that the crypto voter is real. We've seen a lot of polling. There's a poll back from May that 1 in 5 voters in swing states considers cryptocurrency an important issue in the upcoming election. There have been many other polls that have like similar things, but when you're dealing with these races where it's a small number of votes that are going to move a candidate one way or another, having a good crypto policy position is important. So the crypto voter is real. And then, as Matthew mentioned, the crypto advocate is active. Stand With Crypto has nearly 2 million members. We're great allies of them. They have a way for individuals to get involved, to weigh in with legislation, to reach out to their candidates. And so not only are people voting on crypto, at least in a small percentage, but they're being very active and engaged in the process. And then the last is that the crypto industry is organized and mature. When I was the first person the board of the Blockchain Association hired 6 years ago, and I was the only person at the Blockchain Association for a whole year, and I could count on two hands the number of people working on these issues. There are hundreds of professionals in Washington that are working in-house at big companies, at trade associations, there's a patchwork of organizations like the Blockchain Association, DeFi Education Fund, Stand With Crypto, Cedar Innovation Foundation. We all work together. We all serve slightly different roles, and that this is a sophisticated, mature operation. We have a real lease in a real building. It's not a WeWork anymore, right? And so I think that given the presence in Washington at such a high level, that that we will get these problems solved, and we'll get a good framework in place, and I think it's going to happen in short order. So yeah, I'm excited for next year, and I think we just need to get through the election. We need to get Congress back. We need to get the new regulators in place, and we'll be ready to go.
That's fantastic. Thank you for those closing words, Kristen. Thank you, Mitch, as well. There's an election every 2 years in America, and I would never have anticipated that we would be where we are today, looking into this 4-week time frame. I thought that the 2026, the 2028, the 2030 elections would be won because the digital natives are aging and they care, and they will eventually win this argument because they are the future. But your hard work, Kristen, and the hard work of your team and your association have actually accelerated all of this by 2, 4, 6 years. And for us as long-term investors looking at a 10-year time frame, that's very exciting. So thank you so much for all of your hard work. Thank you to the audience for being with us. We will post this recording. And as mentioned, Kristen is available and accessible for any of you who want to reach out to her, as is her organization. So thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to close down this webinar. Thank you.